All right, let's get started. Welcome everyone to this Build Peace webinar. As many of you know, if you've joined before, we try to host these monthly calls on different topics and with different practitioners in this field, and always look forward to those we're hearing from. Today we have one of our own presenting, Maud Morrison. She is the Deputy Director of Build Up and has also been doing over the past year, Maud, this deep dive into social media and mediation. So we're really excited to hear some of the results on that and things that we should be thinking about moving forward. So Maud, I'll hand this to you. You may also say this, Maud, but she is on some crappy internet and with low power situations. So if an emergency happens, it's okay. We will deal with it. And yeah, we're just looking forward. Right now it's working, so.
Perfect. Thanks, Julie. And if it gets, if the sound isn't good, I'll turn my video off, but I'll keep it on for now. Would you be able to do the screen share? Thank you. So thanks everyone for joining. It's nice to have everybody here and have an opportunity to share a little bit about some of the work I've been doing and some of the things I've been thinking about. Just to say, all of this is still kind of continuous. So we haven't, none of this are kind of foregone conclusions, but rather we wanted to share with you where our thinking has got to, and some of the sort of initial thoughts we have about this topic of social media and conflict mediation. This is an increasing area of interest for Build Up. We come at this topic from the peace building field very much. But we're starting to see how some of the lessons learned and some of the things we've been doing for the past 4 or 5 years can actually be applied also in the world of mediation practice. So if you go to the next slide, the first question is really why this interest? And perhaps it's also a question for participants, like why did you show up today? What is it about this that interests you? I think when we look at mediation traditionally, it's been very much focused on kind of physical drivers of conflict. So conflict mediation looked at how weapons and violence and these kind of physical drivers have influenced conflicts, and how can mediation be used to minimize the risks of these conflict drivers. We also know that a lot of mediation traditionally happened offline, often in confidential spaces and in physical dialogues. And I think there are 2 reasons why we need to start talking more about the link between social media and mediation. So if you go to the next slide. The first reason is obvious to all of you, and that is that more and more conversations are happening online. And we see this obviously a lot in 2020 because of COVID-19 and because everybody has shifted a lot of their work online, including us at Build Up. And so conversations are happening on social media about mediation processes. So things like discussions about a peace process. A lot of mediators express concerns about leaks about dialogues happening on social media, but also mediation processes and dialogues themselves are happening in online spaces. We've seen mediators use things like Zoom to start to have some virtual dialogues. So it's simply become a necessity to start talking about social media when we talk about mediation. This is just the way that conversations are happening now, and to ignore that would be to ignore reality. Now the second and probably more interesting reason, and the thing that we focus more on at Build Up, is that we can't ignore now that social media is becoming part of conflict contexts across the world, and this is not unique to one place or another. We're seeing the emergence of what we call digital conflict drivers. So we're no longer only talking about weapons or physical elements of a conflict, but about digital drivers as well. And a little bit more on that, if you go to the next slide, Julie. We used to think at Build Up that technology was very much a neutral tool. So we used to think that it was a tool and we could use it both in positive ways and in negative ways. We've started to shift our thinking a little bit on that over the last year or so. We're realizing that technology is no longer a completely neutral space, but it is actually in many cases and in many ways, changing fundamentally our human experiences and therefore altering the way that conflicts happen. And there are three kind of key digital conflict drivers which we are starting to look into, conducting research on and thinking more and more about. And these are the three that you see on the screen now. So we know that technology and social media, and particularly, I'm going to use sort of technology and social media interchangeably, but the topic of this webinar is really about social media. We know that it is starting to change some of our incentives, that this is a mass gathering of data about us, about what we do, what our preferences are, etc. And that social media can sometimes use algorithms to make certain decisions for us that then in turn shift our incentives more. We also know that social media, or we believe that social media is starting to affect how we construct discourse. We know that social media platforms seek to maximize engagement, that they target us with certain information or narratives, exposing us to certain people or experiences. And this can create a certain discourse, a certain sense of reality on social media that actually shifts how we talk about things, the narratives that we see, and the way that we frame debates. We also see kind of this idea of manufactured consensus. So sometimes it seems like a lot of people are saying something on social media when it's in fact only a few people. And this kind of affects the whole way that conversations are happening. And in conflict situations, we're seeing this affect in turn the discourse around a particular conflict. And we are particularly interested in this last question around identity formation. So there is increasing evidence that social media is affecting the way we build our identities, how we represent ourselves. And we know that there's a strong link between identity formation and conflict. So these three things are interacting. All of this to say that social media is affecting how conflict happens, and we need to understand that technology is part of conflict contexts in many, if not all, places, and that there are such things as digital conflict drivers. So what does that mean? It means that we need to think of digital technologies as a space for mediation, not only as a tool. And there's a need for us to mediate and engage in conflict prevention activities in the digital space. So how do these two things actually interact? Well, we think there are kind of two main ways to look at this topic of social media and mediation. The first is to think about how does social media apply to the field of mediation? And the second is to think about, and I'll go into these in more detail, how does mediation as a field apply to social media as a topic? And I think these two different ways of looking at it are quite interesting. So if we go to the first one, social media applied to mediation, what do I mean by this? I mean, how can mediators use the tools of social media to enhance their existing work? And if you think about, and many of you will know some of the work that Build Up does, this is what we've been doing in the peace building space for some time now. So we've been equipping peace building actors to use technology and use social media to increase the impact of their work. Much of that work has been done at the grassroots level with local peace builders through our peace innovators and fellowship programs. And we have developed a framework for thinking about this, thinking about the three functions that technology can play in peace building. So we think about these three functions of data management, strategic communications, and dialogue and networking. And many of you, if you've attended any of our webinars or read any of our reports, will be familiar with this framework. We're starting to see that that can actually also apply to the mediation field. So the way that we use social media or technology in the peace building field can also be used by mediators to increase the impact of the work that they're doing. So let me tell you a bit more about that. The first sort of function that we see technology having for peace building, or in this case mediation, is about data management. So presenting, visualizing, analyzing, or collecting data in different ways. When it comes to mediation, the kind of key trend that we're seeing here is the possibility of social media to help identify entry points for dialogue. This might seem obvious to many of you, but it's something that hasn't been done particularly often or particularly thoroughly, I think. So we conducted at Build Up a big social media analysis piece in Lebanon, which is where I'm based, looking at what are the different narratives in the online space around Syrian refugees in Lebanon. And this wasn't with a mediation focus, but what we can see is that this could apply very easily to the field of mediation. So social media analysis or social media mapping can really help identify topics, people, places that could be entry points for mediation processes. We also are doing an increasing amount of work on online and virtual consultations, of which social media can be a big part of that. We're experimenting quite a bit with the role of chatbots, for example, in gathering information from a population that could then be used to inform a dialogue process or kickstart a dialogue process. So that's a concrete way that data management can be used in mediation. The second key function of technology for peace building or for mediation is this idea of strategic communications. So how can you tell stories in new or different ways, create space for new voices to speak about conflict or about peace building? And here, I think the parallel to mediation is quite clear. Social media can be a really powerful tool to help build legitimacy around a dialogue process. We've seen, obviously, the flip side of this. We've seen the power of social media to undermine dialogue processes, and this is what often mediators are very concerned about, the potential undermining power of social media. But there's also a huge potential of a proactive role for social media in promoting legitimacy. You can do that through traditional social media campaigns. This common imagination is something we worked on in Myanmar, not related to mediation, but related to building kind of a community and growing legitimacy of a campaign through Facebook. But we also know that there are creative ways of using messaging, for example, or targeting to grow the legitimacy of a dialogue or a peace process, both as it's happening and also after it's happened. And the third and final function that we see technology and social media playing in mediation processes is that of dialogue and networking. So we at Build Up have been experimenting with social media as a platform for dialogue in the peace building space, and we think that there are parallels and potential for this to apply also in terms of mediation processes. So we can see now that a lot of dialogue is starting to go online. So there are virtual dialogue platforms being used, for example, Zoom. We have seen less use of social media as actually a platform for dialogue. It doesn't necessarily lend itself as easily to the kind of dialogues that we often think about as related to mediation, particularly common social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter, which tend to be more about statements and less about conversation. But we are experimenting with that, and we've been using in the project called The Commons, which is a big project we run in the US. We've been using Facebook and Twitter as a platform to increase, to build constructive discourse online in the US, and we'd be happy to tell you more about that in the Q&A. So that's a little bit of the first bucket. So this is social media tools being used to enhance the impact of mediation processes. The second bucket that I talked about at the beginning is this idea that mediation could, as a field, be applied to the challenges of social media and these digital conflict drivers that I mentioned at the beginning. This is probably a less familiar area of work. This is perhaps where there's a lot of thinking still to be done. But it's, I think, a really interesting area of work. I'm really sorry, my doorbell has just rung, but I'm going to ignore it. I'm sorry about that. So Julie, if you can go to the next slide. What we're interested in this bucket is the possibility of limiting some of those digital conflict drivers, limiting the harms of social media through mediation itself. So through, in the first instance, dialogue with conflict parties directly about some of their actions online. And where we see this going is potentially to the formation of agreements or codes of conduct around the social media space. So traditionally, as I said at the beginning, mediation has often been about mediating physical elements of a conflict. And this here we're thinking about, well, what would it look like to mediate digital elements of a conflict? And I think this is a really interesting area of work for us. I mentioned this idea of a social media code of conduct. This is something we are starting to imagine and consider at Build Up. And some of the work I've been doing over the last few months has really been trying to spell out what would this actually look like? What could this look like? A social media, what we call a social media code of conduct. So some kind of agreement coming out of some kind of a dialogue process. The purpose of a code of conduct would be twofold. There are two issues that we care about when it comes to social media and conflict. The first is content. So that's things that you actually see on social media. So specific forms of hate speech, for example, perhaps mis or disinformation. So we would want social media code of conducts to address these kinds of problematic types of content. And the second part of this would be behavior. So content is only one side of the story. There's also a lot of different ways that you can use social media that can be problematic in a conflict context. So this is for example, what we call coordinated inauthentic behavior, or the prevalence of fake or bot accounts. And we would want to tackle both of these issues. So tackling content, tackling things like hate speech is only one side of the story. It's also about how these platforms are used. So that would be the purpose of a code of conduct. And then what would that code of conduct look like? What kinds of things would it include? If you go to the next slide, I think there are two main pieces that would have to make up this theoretical social media code of conduct, which is still very much in thinking phase. The first piece of this content would have to be restrictive clauses. So you would have to come to some kind of agreement to prevent certain types of activity on social media. And again, we're talking both about content and about behavior. So we would want to use these dialogue processes and use a code of conduct to prevent certain types of problematic content, both content that refers to the dialogue itself. So that would be things like preventing leaks or preventing rumors or misinformation about a negotiation process. And then we might also want to look at preventing the sharing of problematic content that is related to the conflict itself. So things like hate speech, disinformation that actually makes a conflict dividing line worse. We would also then want to look at prevention of certain types of behavior. So the coordinated inauthentic behavior that's designed to drive a conflict, or the use of fake accounts to misrepresent political actors, for example. We might want to prevent certain types of micro-targeting along conflict lines. These are all areas that would fall under what we call restrictive clauses. So restrictive means do not X, Y, Z. The other side of the coin would be to develop active clauses. So these would be things that are more about encouraging certain types of content and behavior. So rather than saying do not X, Y, and Z, it would be saying actively do certain things. And here we might want to encourage proactive content about the dialogue process of a given agreement, a given mediation process. So maybe the proactive use of social media to put out accurate statements, for example, or to develop a campaign. We might also want to encourage proactive responses to problematic content. So for example, the countering of hate speech or the correcting of disinformation. Those things might fall under active clauses, things that we would want to actively encourage conflict parties to do. And then we might also want to actively encourage certain types of behavior, such as maybe the engagement of specific constituencies, or the promotion of constructive dialogue on social media, or maybe even the promotion of media literacy in a given setting. So these are the kinds of things that we would put under the active clauses bucket. Of course, this is all very ambitious, and we're not expecting suddenly a code of conduct to include all of these elements, but it's just to say that these are the different things that we would want to think about when it comes to mediation in the online space or on the social media space. This comes with a huge number of challenges, of which there are many, and I won't go into them all today, but I think there are three challenges that keep coming out whenever we talk about what would it look like to mediate conflict in the digital space. The first one is a definitional challenge. So how do we define what we mean by any of the things that I just talked about that could go into a code of conduct? As you know from codes of conducts that have been agreed in many places about many things, including, for example, elections, often if you have very vague language, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to stick to a code of conduct. And when it comes to social media, we know that there are a lot of words that get thrown around, things like misinformation or hate speech. And without being very specific about what we mean by those terms, it will be very difficult to make a code of conduct actionable. So we really need to get specific before we can have any kind of dialogue with the conflict parties about what an issue is. So the way we do that, I think there's a big role to play, a big role for social media mapping or analyses of the social media landscape as a starting point to any of this kind of mediation, because it's really important that we define in any given conflict context, what is the issue, what are the challenges specific to social media and conflict, and then how can we frame the language of any kind of dialogue process. The second challenge, as with any agreement, is of course monitoring. So this is something that many of you will know much more about than me in terms of how to monitor an agreement. In this case, the monitoring of a social media or an agreement that incorporated social media would of course involve social media monitoring or social media analysis capacities. There would need to be monitoring both of individual violations of an agreement. So that would be things like, how do we deal with the restrictive clauses that I just laid out? So if there's an agreement not to promote certain types of hate speech, and then it does happen, we need to be able to monitor that. But then there would also be probably a need to monitor the more general online environment in order to evaluate the impact of the more active clauses. So if there is an active clause to try to promote media literacy, well, how do you monitor that? It needs to be monitored probably over the long term through general online analyses. And then the final challenge is, of course, incentives. So how would you get parties to come to the table to talk about this? It's something that is going to be a big challenge, and it's going to have to involve a lot of groundwork, a lot of dialogue, a lot of discussion to actually get people to recognize that this is an issue. In the mediation field, they talk about hurting stalemate. Well, what does that look like in the online space? I don't think it's something that's been particularly explored yet, and we're really interested in talking about that further. So this slide is designed, and these 3 challenges are designed also as challenges to you all in terms of what do we do about these 3 things and the many other challenges that come with this. How do we overcome them? And it's not going to be easy, but it's I think something we all need to think about. What do we do with all of this? And I want to leave like half the time for questions. So I just want to end with a couple of final thoughts. I think that it's really important that when we talk about social media and mediation, we stop talking only about this idea of social media as a threat to mediation processes. It's true that leaks on social media and the use of social media to undermine dialogue is a big issue, but I think that we have to go beyond that now, because so much of the conversation has moved online and so much of the conflict context is impacted by what happens on social media, that it has to be a bigger conversation beyond just how do we prevent the use of social media to undermine dialogue processes. So I hope that this conversation can help start to move things forward and to create a bit of a bigger discussion around this topic. And I think this idea of digital conflict drivers really needs to be explored further. There is a lot of research that needs to be done to understand in any given context, what is it about the social media space that is driving conflict, and what could we do about it in any given space. So I'm going to stop there and welcome any of your questions or comments or feedback. And Julie, if you have any further things to add, please feel free.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just add that there's a Q&A feature on the bottom, so you can chat in your questions for Maud that way. But we're also happy for you to just speak in. To do that, you have to raise your hand, and then I can give you the mic capacity. So there's a feature for both. While we're waiting for questions to come in, Maud, I wonder if you could speak to, or if you want to, I'm putting you on the spot here, your move to HD and like maybe what this portfolio is going to look like for you, further exploring the question.
Yeah. So I guess I haven't really talked about this publicly, but yes,
Coming
this will this will be my last webinar, or I guess event with Build Up. I'm actually changing after 3 years with Build Up, and I'll be joining the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, where I will be exploring these questions in more detail. So building their work on social media and conflict. And yeah, I think watch this space. We'll talk more, and we'll stay in touch, of course, on these questions. I think it's something that many actors are like thinking much more about. Yeah. But yeah, I don't have too much more to add on the specifics of it at the moment.
Right.
Just to say it's happening.
Cool. Thanks for I hate to make you make an announcement against your will, but
yeah. It's out now.
It is. It's fully out. Okay, we have a question coming in from Layla. So super interesting and super relevant. It'd be interesting to follow the trend and see how we can create this code of conduct / who will be the actors behind this. It's less of a question, more of a statement, which I imagine you just agreed to. Yeah. We do have a question coming in from To Ong. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. Who has a question related to trust building. How can we generally build trust among different stakeholders when we are conducting conflict mediation online?
Yeah, so I think that's a really hot topic at the moment. I'm guessing you mean more, is this question more directed to kind of like online dialogue processes rather than social media specifically? If so, I think, yeah, we've had a few conversations about how you build trust virtually. And often people that have been working on mediation and have been transitioning online over the last few months have said like a lot of the trust building kind of there needs to be a baseline of trust, and if you have that baseline, if you have that familiarity between actors, then you can transition online. That it's actually very difficult to make the initial contact, the initial trust building. It can be difficult to do online, but if you have it as a baseline, then there are certain like things you can do. I don't know, Julie, you might have actually more to add on this from your work on virtual exchange and things like that.
Yeah, I'd say I would just echo that the offline incentives and offline polls become extra important, and trust building online like has to be a longer process that is designed in a different way than an offline. So it's not something that you can just transfer, the same methods and timelines that you would use offline to be online. It has to be designed differently. Yeah. All right, we have another question here. Which conflicts would be mediated? There are so many.
Yeah, it's true. There are so many, but it's also true that not every conflict is going to be relevant for this right now. I've started to think about what are some of the criteria that would make a conflict relevant for this kind of mediation. I think there are kind of three things, or three parts to this. One is the technology setup of a particular place. So how much is technology playing into the conflict? How widely accessed is it? How much freedom of expression is there in the online space? To what extent do people in a particular place rely on social media for information about political or social events? Because if you're in a very low tech environment or in a very highly restricted tech environment, then it's going to be much more difficult to do this kind of work. And the second element of whether or not a conflict is relevant to this is there a link between conflict and social media? So is there evidence of the kinds of content or the kinds of behavior that I talked about before? So a link between sort of hate speech that's related to the conflict, or polarization that's related to the conflict, or a lot of political manipulation online. So these are things that you would want to assess. And then finally, kind of at what stage is existing mediation processes, because often this would tie in with existing dialogue processes or engagement. So I think you would want to think about all of those, and that maybe can narrow us down to look at a few case studies.
To call in as well, which is relevant to this question about sort of where would this be applied. We've said we need more research and more action on understanding digital conflict drivers. The Toda Peace Institute, through which we have Lisa Shirk here, they are already on the charge driving a lot of this research, and they've published, this is in the chat, so I'm just reading it out, published 13 case studies of the positive and negative impact of social media on conflict dynamics in 13 different countries. So those case studies, and I've read them as well, are just really useful to say this is the way that social media is affecting conflict dynamics in different ways in different places. So that can be a great place to start to begin to think about what context this is most relevant for. All right, we have another question, Maud. This is from Jasmine. She says, I wonder, can mediation and dialogue take place in public digital spaces where representatives may be speaking more strategically and politically, or only in protected private digital spaces? How can such spaces be protected to enable true dialogue?
Yeah, so I think different kinds of dialogue will need to take place in different spaces. So like the kind of dialogue that you would traditionally take place offline, the kind of sort of traditional mediation, if you like, I don't think that that's something that can just be transferred online easily. I think that what we're probably talking about is some kind of complementarity of approaches. So some things would happen online. In some things might happen in public digital spaces. So this idea of kind of online consultations maybe that would feed into a mediation process could happen publicly. Other things might need to happen in protected spaces, what you call protected digital spaces, or even protected offline spaces. So I think that different conversations have to take place in different types of space. I don't know, in terms of how can such spaces be protected to enable true dialogue, I think that's both an issue of security, and that just depends on what you're using, what platforms you're using, but also in terms of expectations management and trust of participants in a particular space. Sometimes more important than the actual security of the space is also what people perceive to be private or not. Julie, feel free to add.
Yeah, I would just add there's also a risk there in more dialogue spaces than in mediation, which I imagine might be more private, is that people think they're more anonymous or more private than they are often online. And so that's another key of just communicating about risk and building accurate representations of what the actual security risks are in that space for people that might think they're communicating online in a really anonymous way. Most often that can be tracked. So great. I have a question for you, Maud. When you're speaking to these different audiences, peace building is a big field and a lot of people are doing it in a lot of different ways. Sometimes I feel like track one level mediators, like the ones that might be coming up with this kind of code of conduct, are involved in the conversation in a unique way, and that they're certainly focused on this track one level and often aren't on this communication that peace building has about track three, trust building and community development and the place where peace building is. I'm wondering, as you're talking to these different audiences, what their worries are, what their concerns are, what the connections between the peace building field at large versus mediators, and maybe where some of the divides are. That's a big question. I'm just wondering how this is applied to different audiences within peace building.
Yeah, I think it's still something I'm learning, because I'm coming very much from the peace building background and not from the mediation background. So it's something I'm still experimenting, how do different audiences react. But one thing that I have noticed, and we've done a fair amount of work helping mediators think through some of these issues around technology, is that, and I mentioned this a bit in the presentation, about the question of confidentiality and privacy of dialogue, and seeing social media as a threat is still quite prevalent, and there's still a big concern about, well, how do we, what do we do if a leak happens, or what do we do if a tweet goes out and it undermines the dialogue process that's taking place offline. And part of, I really understand where that's coming from, because I think there's a lot of examples of that happening, but there are many less examples of more proactive stances by mediators. I think there's a nervousness around social media that I think perhaps, I don't know, when we work with local peace builders, there's maybe has been more experimentation or more trial and error, and I think perhaps the mediation field is catching up and looking now to try and pilot some things. But the focus for a long time, I think, has been on protection of private spaces, and now the question is, how do we translate that and recognize that this is a broader issue? It's not just about protection from threat, but also actually dealing with the conflict in all of its forms.
It's really interesting.
Yeah.
We have 5 more minutes of space for 1 or 2 more questions. If you have them, you can chat them in. While we're waiting, Maud, I wonder where you would point people if they want to learn more about this specific intersection. Are there specific resources or guides that they could go to?
Good question. There is, I could follow up with a few resources. I know there was a piece by Swiss Peace that looked specifically at conflict and mediation, which is quite good. I'll try to find it and link it in the chat.
Okay.
But yeah, there's a little, and the resources that Lisa mentioned, I think, are really great, and I would encourage anybody who hasn't read them to read them, because also they look specifically at specific case studies, which I think has been missing. Yeah, I'm just trying to find the Swiss Peace paper.
You're fine.
Yeah. Here we go. It's called The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And I will link it in the chat. And there's also a piece, kind of blog post that we just wrote about code of conducts.
Awesome.
Yeah, and actually there's another, so I will link 3 things in the chat for everyone.
Perfect. I just find it to be such an obvious, yet I personally haven't thought about it, and I wonder if others feel this way too, that social media becomes like part of the space in which it has to be negotiated, and that you're not only negotiating, maybe disarmament and communication tactics and electoral agreements and things like that, but that social media becomes an inherent and inevitable part of that space.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, Lisa has chatted in.
The world is changing, and I think we have to change with it.
Perfect. It looks like maybe not everyone has seen that resource that she posted, so I'm going to link Lisa's question resource also in the chat. These are the social media case studies. Okay, yeah, I see, because that comment had only went to us before. Perfect, so
Yeah.
we have some resources in the chat for how to explore further if you're interested. Maud is also on Twitter and some other places if you want to reach out to her. Maud, can I volunteer that to you? Yeah.
Of course. Yeah.
Great, and you can, if you want to.
Sure, yeah, happy to stay in touch.
Awesome. Looks like we're getting some robot voice, so good timing. This recording will be posted on the Build Up website. So if you want to return back or need to copy these resources again, you're welcome to do so there. And we can also link these resources there as well. Thanks so much, Maud, and thanks everyone for joining and your really great questions. Really enjoyed this discussion.
Thank you, and sorry for being in the half darkness, but we have no power here, so I'm doing what I can.
We made it through the full 45 minutes without any hiccups.
Yeah, very happy about that. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.